Welcome to the David Cooke collection at the Bressingham Steam Museum near Diss in Norfolk. We're going to show you part of my collection of Dinky Toys. Dinky Toys were invented by Frank Hornby. He also made Meccano and Hornby trains. Dinky Toys evolved from the Hornby trains, which were made in the 1920s and 1930s. He initially made small figures to go with the Hornby trains, and these were called initially model miniatures. However, these toys, like these farm animals here also, which were made in the 1930s, were very popular with children. And children asked for more. They wrote to the Meccano magazine, which was the advertising part of the Meccano empire, and asked for model cars and model trucks and model buses. Frank Hornby was a very clever entrepreneur, and he'd built his factory in Binns Road in Liverpool from the 1920s. He felt that there was this need for smaller cars and smaller buses to complement his already existing Meccano and Hornby sets. First of all, he produced these tiny miniature figures and smaller trains. This is one of the earlier trains, one of the passenger train sets, and number 16 is one of the Silver Jubilee train sets, which also came out in the 1930s. So successful was Frank Hornby and the Meccano factory that he then developed the model cars, which we're so familiar with today. One of the first series was the well-known 22 series. And these three models here represent just part of that very famous series. After saloon and sports cars, he went on to produce racing cars, and a whole series of 23 series racing cars was produced not only before the war, but later after the Second World War. All different types and sizes of cars and trucks were produced. Normally, they were in this scale, which is approximately 1/48th of the actual car. This is a Chrysler Airflow produced in the 1930s, which is quite rare today. However, the factory also produced much smaller scale models, like these little sports cars and Austin 7s, together with the motorbikes, the RAC and the police motorcycle combinations. These were actually to complement the later Hornby 00 series, which was introduced just before the war in the late 1930s. As well as cars, sports cars, famous Rolls-Royce, Vauxhall cars, the factory also produced ambulances and other trucks and vans and military vehicles. All of these models here were produced during the 1930s or later produced through into the 1940s and early 1950s. The 28 series vans are very collectible today. There were, in fact, 75 different vans produced, from the very first, which was a square-shaped van, to a more rounded one, and later the third series of 28 series vans, like these ones, produced in all different colours with all different adverts. And today you would need a king's ransom to purchase one of these little vans, which in the 1930s sold for a mere 6 old pence. Trucks were also produced, and these come from the 25 series. There was a whole range of trucks, including the flat truck, the market gardener's wagon, the tipping wagon, and the trailer, which could be attached to any of these trucks. There was an unusual and one-off 6-wheeler truck, also in the 25 series, which was also adapted for the military series and again was produced after the war in the late 1940s, along with other military vehicles like the tank and the anti-aircraft gun. The Jeep actually came after the war, but the smaller tank was also produced before the war. This little trailer was only produced in the late 1930s, and today is considered very, very rare and very collectible. Another series of cars produced by the Meccano factory in Binns Road were the sports cars, which were the 38 series, and there's a number here. This one in particular is extremely rare since it was made just before the war. It has, as you can see, a silver bottom, a silver chassis. It also has white tyres and a line around the windscreen. This identifies that particular model as a pre-war model, and as the 38 series were only introduced just before the war, this model, therefore, is very rare. Another collectible series of toys is the 39 series, which were based on American pre-war sedans. This particular model from the 1930s is unusual, since after the war, when they were reproduced from 1946 onwards, this particular model was exported to America. And in the 1950s, the early 1950s, it appeared in 2 colors, which was unusual, since these vehicles normally appeared just in 1 color. Record cars were not missed either, and models of the Speed of the Wind and the MG record car were also produced in the Binns Road factory. This representation here today shows the majority of the toys that were produced in the Meccano factory by Dinky Toys from the 1930s, when the first model miniatures appeared, up to 1950, after they had been reintroduced after the Second World War. And this is really the end of that particular era of basic construction of a car body or a truck body, tires and wheels, and a chassis. In the next section of the film, we will go on to more sophistication in dinky toy production. After their considerable success in the 1930s and after the war in the 1940s, when they started production again in 1946, dinky toys were even more popular. And through into the 1950s and early 1960s, this was the highlight of Dinky Toy production at Binns Road in Liverpool. After the Second World War, more and more children and families wanted to buy Dinky Toys, particularly at Christmas and for their birthdays. And the range continued to increase and improve as the years went by. The 1950s were particularly good years for Dinky Toys. Just before the introduction of Corgi toys in 1956, Dinky Toys really held the whole market in this die-cast world. After the late 1940s, when the pre-war models were reintroduced in often dull colors, the 1950s brought a new series of toys, and the first of which was the 40 series of saloon cars. The very first being the Riley 1.5 litre saloon car. But this was a series of British cars produced from the late 1940s through the 1950s, including the Morris Oxford, the Standard Vanguard, and the Rover 75. Dinky Toy intended to introduce new models, but although they reached the drawing stage, the drawing board stage, they didn't actually reach production for one reason or another. And examples of models which didn't actually go into production is the Standard Vanguard 3, which should have carried on from the previous Standard Vanguard, the Rover 105, which would have replaced the Rover 75, and the XK140, which would have eventually replaced the XK150. Other possibilities would have been this Austin Somerset in a drop head configuration. Racing cars continued to be popular in the 1950s, and a whole new range of 23 series added to the pre-war ones that we have seen previously. These were very colourful and comprised of half a dozen different well-known racing cars, including the Ferrari and the Alfa Romeo. American cars were not neglected either, and these were popular for exporting to the United States in particular, and also to Canada. And Dinky Toys produced a range of well-known American cars, including the Ford four-door in different colors and liveries, and other American coupes. There was even an American sports car, which was the Cunningham, which was produced in sports car livery, along with quite a few other sports cars, including the MG and later the Austin Healey. Continental cars were also covered, and the popular Volkswagen Beetle appears again in quite attractive livery, as well as the Porsche and the Volkswagen Ghia. These were just some of the saloon, sports, and racing cars produced throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s. Most of these models here do not have plastic windows. This is because in the early 1950s they were still basic models, very similar to those produced in the 1930s and late 1940s. However, when Corgi Toys appeared on the scene in 1956, advertised as the ones with windows, Dinky Toys, of course, had to compete. And 2 years later, it took them that long to produce Dinky Toys with windows. And the Volkswagen gear is an example of one of the first Dinky Toys with windows. Although they had windows, they didn't have interiors as Corgi Toys had had interiors, and these came along later in the 1960s, along with opening doors. These basic models here had not too many extra features, but they were in much brighter colors, as you can see. We've covered the cars. Now we can move on to the commercial vehicles of the 1950s, of which there were many. First of all, there were the medium-sized and smaller commercial vehicles, such as these ones here. And also, Dinkies were producing toys in a much larger size, which included the ones that you can see here. These were often called Dinky Super Toys, although they didn't always use the name Super Toy, depending on what marketing aspects they were using at that particular time. We'll cover first some of the smaller commercial vehicles, which included farm vehicles, and this estate car is unusual in that, although it appeared in these colors on the box, actually never appeared in production in cream and red. This was a version made for the United States. Other vans included the popular Milk Float, the Austin Dinky Toy van, and these are another pair of toys which actually didn't reach production, although they were produced in the reverse colors. In other words, this one appeared as a red Royal Mail van, and this little Morris appeared as a post office van with a ladder on top. They look particularly nice in these unusual liveries. Other smaller trucks included the Leyland and the Austin, the Daimler ambulance, and a larger Jeep, again for the American market. In the UK, it was produced in red, along with a Land Rover, which were part of the farm series, which included tractors, trailers, and other farm equipment. Fire engines were also popular, and there was a whole range of fire engines, including the very popular Dennis, and there were fire engines in the larger Super Toy range as well. In the late 1940s, Dinkies introduced two very important series of trucks. The first of which were the Guy series of trucks, along with the Fodens. The Guy vans appeared in many liveries, one of the most popular of which is this Weetabix van in yellow. All these Guy vans are very collectible today and go for high prices when they reach the auction rooms. Also selling for high prices are the Foden trucks, first introduced in the late 1940s and continued to be produced during the 1950s, always popular with young boys. The Bedford Articulated came in several different versions, including the basic truck. It also came as a Pullmore car transporter, where the young boy could put his cars, load his cars onto the top of the truck. The replacement of the ordinary Bedford with the long bonnet was this more modern Bedford, which Dinky called the Big Bedford truck. That sold in millions. And virtually every schoolboy of the 1950s had a Bedford truck like that in his collection. Buses were no exception either, of course, and we'll cover buses in more detail later on. This vehicle is unusual in that it contains a wooden Hornby furniture van on the back of a flat truck. What has happened here is that a modeller has changed the model, the original Big Bedford truck, and converted it into a flat truck in order to put the Hornby furniture van on the back. What it originally looked like before alteration was this ordinary Bedford truck. I think you'll agree it's a very good change. Dinky Toys were also made in France, and this is an example of one of the vans that were made in France, although many other cars and trucks were also made in France in the Dinky Toy factory there at the same time as those being produced in Binns Road in Liverpool. Another example of a French car, a French Dinky Toy, is this Ferrari, which was produced for the French market as opposed to the blue and yellow one, which was produced for the UK and the American markets. I think you will agree that these are much more colourful than the previous Dinky Toys produced in the 1930s, and one can see why these particular toys were very popular with youngsters during the 1950s and early 1960s.
The AEC Routemaster, the London double-decker bus, was always very popular with children, and Dinky Toy made this bus from the 1960s right through until the factory closed in 1979. This version is one of the earlier ones with the turn shirt advert. Very popular in the 1950s were all types of buses, including this Maudsley single-decker coach, unusual in blue and cream. At the time of the Queen's Silver Jubilee, Dinky Toy brought out a number of buses in silver, and this one is unusual, being sold only through the Woolworth group of shops. It is a Leyland Atlantean double-decker of the 1970s. This really is the ubiquitous Dinky Toy bus. 29C and 290 was the number, and it was produced from the mid-1930s right through to the end of the 1960s. Several million were made in very many different colours and liveries. This half-cab luxury coach, which was unusual and originally produced in the late 1949, early 1950 period, did not last long in the catalogues and was soon to be replaced by the Maudsley luxury coach. This is an unusual vehicle, and not many appeared as a real vehicle on the road. It is called an observation coach and had a Maudsley chassis together with a Whitson 1.5-decker coach body. It was very attractive to children and was bought in their thousands. The Duple Roadmaster Leyland Royal Tiger coach was very popular, this one appearing in red, although other versions appeared in blue, and there were more rare versions in green and cream. One of the last coaches to be produced by Dinky Toys in the 1950s was this attractive blue and white BOAC coach. It's based on a Harrington bus and would travel from the centre of London to London Airport. As we explained, during the 1950s, Dinky Toy was the dominant manufacturer in the die-cast British toy industry. However, Corgis came on the scene in 1956, and Dinky's had to change so that they would be able to compete and sell more toys within the huge market. Corgi Toys introduced windows in 1956, but it wasn't until 1958 that Dinky Toys introduced windows into their cars. It was still basically the same type of car as they had been during the early 1950s. From 1960 onwards, however, Dinky Toys progressed quite considerably. And as well as introducing the plastic windows, cars appeared with plastic interiors and drivers and other accessories. Typical of the early 1960s is the Jaguar. The Volvo 122 during the 1960s was still a basic car, although it had windows and an interior and independent suspension. But there were no opening parts, and Corgis were now introducing opening bonnets and opening doors on their models. So Dinky Toys had to compete as well. And we will show you models with these opening parts in a few moments. One of the last survivors of the 1950s was the Foden, which had been introduced early in 1947 and continued to be produced throughout the 1950s. It was a very attractive toy and sold in millions. This particular one was one of the last ones to be produced. It's called the Foden Flat Truck with chains. Another survivor of the 1950s is the Guy Warrior, which acquired windows and was an extension of the Guys that were introduced also in 1947. These two particular models continued to be produced into the early 1960s, but were already looking very much out of date. Into the 1960s and 1970s, Dinky Toy development continued apace, and some of the most attractive and innovative models that were produced came with these sports and saloon cars throughout the 1960s and 1970s. They appeared, as you can see, fully detailed, with opening bonnets, boots, doors. In fact, they had virtually everything a toy collector could want, as you can see on this Ford 40 RV. Unfortunately, some of them appeared in rather garish colours, like pink or orange, but at least they were very attractive models. One very attractive model of this particular period is, of course, the Aston Martin DB6. It's a delightful car, and the real vehicle, of course, is much favoured by sports cars lovers. All manner of modern cars were produced, including the Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, Lamborghini, Monteverdi, all very expensive cars on the road, and all, of course, directed to the younger toy collector. However, Dinky Toys was struggling at this stage. Corgi Toys were already introducing a very successful range. Matchbox Toys were producing their 1 to 75 series and their yesteryear series. And Dinky Toys had to find something different so that they could sell more toys. And just having opening doors and opening boots was not sufficient. In the 1970s, Corgis were selling a lot of toys which were TV and film related. And Dinky Toy also jumped onto this bandwagon. And throughout the 1970s, they introduced various toy, film, and TV related toys, such as the Thunderbirds, the Lady Penelopes, Fab 1, Joe 90, and the USS Enterprise from Star Trek's. Despite their popularity, particularly today, when collectors will want these toys for their collection, Dinky Toys were certainly struggling and finding markets unobtainable. Also, the rising cost of manufacture in the UK sent them abroad to produce models in other countries. At one stage, they were experimenting with toys made in Hong Kong, and this series of American cars were some of the ones that were made in Hong Kong in 1/43 scale. They are particularly attractive, but they didn't last long in the catalogue, and now they are certainly much sought after by collectors. Other toys made abroad, and this was right at the end of their production run, as you can see by this Volvo estate car, which was in police livery. This was made by an Italian toy company in Italy, and then boxed
in the Binns Road factory. As you can see, it was one of the last models to be made. It has speed wheels, which were not very attractive and not very lifelike. And this was virtually the end of Dinky Toy production at the Binns Road factory. Throughout the 1970s and 1960s, various different models were produced, which were unusual, such as the Brinks armoured car, van, a very unusual mobile Midland bank, and this taxi, which was also produced right at the end of production in the late 1970s, before the factory went out of production in 1980. Another type of taxi is illustrated with the Morris 1800, and other vehicles are the AA van, and they produced a special version for Mason paints. Once again, buses were not neglected, neither were road equipment and, of course, the well-known military series. These two particular models were made in the Dinky Toy factory in France. Once again, models were being produced not only in Britain, but also abroad, and these two models of American cars were also made in the Meccano factory at Bobigny, near Paris in France. This period has covered the late 1950s into the early 1960s, with these trucks representing that period and the Jaguars from that period also, right through the next 20 years until the end of production in 1979 with the Volvo, which was made in Italy, and the quite successful Thunderbird series, which unfortunately did not help Dinky Toy, and by 1979, November 1979, the factory closed down, and that was virtually the end of Dinky Toys over this period of almost 50 years of continuous production in their Binns Road factory. A few later models did appear, but they were not like the ones that we have been describing here. Dinky Toy collecting was very important for children, particularly during the height in 1950s, and of course those boys who were collecting then want the nostalgia, the memories of their toy collecting period, and so during the 1990s and into the next century, these toys will still be collected and will continue to rise in value. Always popular with collectors are military vehicles. This one is a Foden six-wheeler and is different from the normal one which appeared in green. This was an experiment by Meccano to see if they could produce different models based on the same moulding. One of the first models to be produced by Meccano was this tiny tractor in the 22 series. It's very attractive in blue, yellow, and red, and continued to be produced until the Second World War began. This little lorry is from the 22 series and was one of the first models to be produced by Dinky Toys in the early 1930s. It continued to be produced throughout the 1930s and was even reintroduced in the 1940s after the war. This shot shows two ambulances from two different eras. The first, the grey and red one, is from the 1930s and is very rare with open windows. The second is an unusual Vauxhall Victor estate car converted to an ambulance which appeared in the 1960s.
always popular with collectors is the Bedford articulated Pullmore car transporter, which here is containing 2 Riley 1.5 litre saloon cars. This was produced from the late 1940s through the 1950s. The world record for a dinky toy in the late 1990s was over £13,000. This was a Benthall's van, Benthall's being a shop in Kingston upon Thames. It was very similar to this little silver shred van, which was produced by Meccano Dinky Toys in the late 1930s. At the time it was produced, it cost 6 old pence. This is the famous Foden 8-wheeler, produced in various guises. This one is the lorry version and was made by Dinky Toys from 1947 onwards. This is an unusual colour combination in having a green cab with a brown body and is very rare today. One of the most expensive series of vans is the Dinky Toy Guy van series, which began in the late 1940s and continued right through to the 1960s. This version in blue has the ever-ready batteries for life transfer on the side and is very valued by collectors today. In the 1950s, Dinky Toys brought out a series of small vans. Included in this series was the Austin A40 van, which came in various colours. This is not a true van, as produced by Dinky Toys, but it is very similar to the Bedford, which they also produced, but is rather charming nevertheless. This is a model of the Austin truck introduced by Dinky Toys in the 1940s, and it continued to be made throughout the 1950s. It appeared in many different liveries, including this military version in green, which was destined for the export market to the United States. The epitome of Dinky Toy production was through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, when models such as these were produced in the Liverpool factory. These were models with opening doors, bonnets and boots, and quite different from the very simple toys of the 1930s. However, with all these additional extras, it didn't save the company from going under, and even with the TV and film-related toys of the 1970s, this again did not stop the factory from ceasing production. There was competition not only from Corgi Toys and Matchbox Toys, but from other hobbies, and computing was coming onto the scene as well. One of the last toys to be produced before the factory closed in 1979 was the Volvo, although this was actually made in Italy. So we've covered here 50 years of production of Dinky Toys from the early 1930s to the late 1970s, which of course gave pleasure to many millions of youngsters, both in the UK and throughout the world.